So, hi everyone, I'm Apurva and I'm currently working in security engineering with TransUnion. Today, Mandy and I are here to kickstart our Secure Diversity Mentorship webinar series called Hey Mentors. Handing over to you, Mandy.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so the idea here is, a lot of folks are really familiar with pen testing when they think about cybersecurity, but there's so much more to it than just that. So we've designed this series to introduce different areas of cybersecurity where folks that are new to cyber or interested in career changing can learn more about different potential areas they can work through. So joining us today, we have Jason Chan, formerly of Netflix, something that you can probably relate to. You probably have it sitting in your home right now, not sharing passwords because that's not a thing we do anymore. But we wanted to talk a little bit about practical product security and how that might be a great role if you're interested in cybersecurity, either as someone new or a career changer. Any other thoughts, Apruva, before we let Jason take the stage and get started?
Yes, Mandy. So, first of all, I'd like to thank Jason for being here. There are a lot of folks out there for everyone to learn from. So, today we're extremely thankful to have Jason and all of his experience from Netflix and all around to share with us. We can't wait for him to get started. Jason, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, I have my cat's yelling at me. I've been traveling for a week, so I think they're a little needy. So if you hear yelling in the background, that's Rosie. So thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I love to talk about security generally, but then I would say especially product security. It's one of those things where, like, if you're a parent, you can't really say you have a favorite child, but if I did have a favorite thing to talk about, it would probably be product security. So I'm excited to share a little bit about kind of my views on product security. And yeah, as mentioned, I spent a little over a decade at Netflix. So I'll kind of use Netflix a little bit as a kind of an example, because I know when I go to sort of talks and presentations, I always like to hear, like, sort of practical, like, what are people doing in the real world versus, kind of generic theoretical stuff. So I'll try to ground it a little bit in reality in terms of some of the stuff that we worked on while I was at Netflix. So I'll go ahead and get started. And also, just context wise, it's probably like 20 or 25 minutes of slides. And then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. So we'll go from there. I would say first off, what kind of frames sort of anything that I talk about in security is to kind of think about where we are as a field. And I always like to use this quote to kind of give a sense of at least where I believe we're at. And this is Alex Stamos, who's actually, he used to be the security leader at Facebook and Yahoo before that. We actually worked together a few times. I have known Alex for a long time. And, he said, this was actually like 5 or 6 years ago, but he said, being a security leader is kind of like being a CFO before accounting was invented, right? So but to me, it just kind of shows we're still kind of figuring things out in our field. So, the example I like to use is if if you take the finance analogy forward, and if you were going to ask, if you went to go five accountants, right, and you ask them, what is a credit? What is a debit? What is revenue? You're going to get the exact same answer. Like, there are very precise definitions for those things. Whereas if you go to five security people and if you ask them, hey, can you define a risk, a threat, a vulnerability? I would guarantee, I would bet a lot of money that you would get five different answers. So that all that is to say is, I think we're still kind of early. So that sort of colors a bit about what I'll talk about today. And another quote I always like is, this one from George Box, a statistician. And he said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And just to kind of illustrate that, right, we've all seen something like this, right? This is a sort of a map of the world. Like, we all know that our planet is actually round, right? And it doesn't have, labels like this. And, that this is not the exact proportion of how things sit. But it's still useful, right? It's still useful to be able to say, here's kind of where the oceans are, and here's where Russia is compared to Brazil. So even though the model is not 100% perfect, it can still be useful. So that's kind of, I just wanted to say I have a particular view of product security. I'm not saying it's the correct view, or it's certainly not the only view, but it's one that's been helpful to me. I've been working in this space, for most of my career. So for a little over 20 years in security, and really mostly in kind of the software security, product security space. And this is kind of the model that I've developed, and it's been useful to me. So I hope it'll be useful for you as well. So at a real high level, before you get into product security, you have to sort of probably ask, before you say what is product security, you probably want to know, well, what is a product, right? So you could kind of think of a product could be a lot of things, right? It could be a fork, right? It could be, a door. It could be any sort of thing. And I would say when we talk about product security, typically we're talking about something that's running software and something that has some sort of connection to the outside world, right? Typically the internet. And it may have a hardware component as well. And so these are some examples here. So you may use this over here on the left. This is a Nest thermostat, so a sort of smart thermostat. If you think about, it's got hardware there, and it's got a lot of software to try to figure out, what's the right temperature to control your house at. How do you administer it? If you use banking, probably you probably use online banking, right? So I use Chase Bank, and Chase Bank, they consider their online banking to be a product, and their security team thinks about product security in the context of online banking. And then here we have a Tesla, and the amount of software in a Tesla is mind blowing. You have autopilot, to do automatic driving. You have remote start, remote door opening. All kinds of, you update the software to get new features. So this is, when you think about products and product security, this is a really, really interesting case. And then, over on the right is what was nearest and dearest to my heart, which was Netflix. And I certainly looked at the Netflix streaming platform as a product, and it has a lot of components, right? So this is a kind of a shot from one of the applications. But if I thought about the Netflix product, I would think it's certainly, the website, and, how you choose what you wanted to watch, and how you recommend things, and, things like that, and, how you pay for things and billing, but it's also all the devices that Netflix runs on. So when I left Netflix about 3 years ago, we had around 220 million users, and those users were using, collectively billions of different devices. So that's a lot of client devices that have software running on them, and it could be anything from an iPhone, it could be a PlayStation, it could be a smart TV. So that's all sort of collectively is a product, and then that's kind of how we think about product security. And sort of before I get started into product security, I wanted to make a little bit of a kind of sort of delineation between two things I think that are both important. So it's product security and product safety, which to me they're very complementary and related, but they're slightly different. So I think about product security is, how do I protect my product from the world, right? All the potential criminals and all the sort of bad things that could happen by putting a product out in the world. People who are trying to steal a Netflix user's, credentials, their login and their password. They're trying to steal information. Maybe they're trying to steal content to pirate it. And then on the other hand, is product safety. And product safety is really, how do you protect the world from your product, right? So if you're going to build a product, right, and you're going to introduce that into the world, what sort of problems could that create for the world? And it's probably easy to think about, if you think about like a Tesla or a self-driving car, well, it's like, oh yeah, sure, there's a lot of ways that could go wrong. It could cause a safety problem. But even with something like Netflix, you might think, oh, geez, well, Netflix, people like to be entertained. What could go wrong in terms of what sort of negative impact could Netflix have on the world? And this is just a few examples, and I don't want to sort of belabor this because we'll focus on security, but I at least wanted to kind of show these two things side by side. So a couple of examples of product safety in the Netflix context. So you see here over here on the left, when you log into your Netflix account, if you want to, you can kind of see the history of who's used your account, and where it's been accessed from, and what sort of devices and when it was accessed from. And that can be useful to kind of see, how is my account being used? But you also have to think about, from a safety perspective, is how could it be misused, right? So if you think about like intimate partner violence, right, where one domestic partner is trying to, maybe track the activity of another or the location of another partner. If I can see on Netflix, oh, this person accessed, from this device in this location at this time, that could be potentially problematic from a safety perspective. So these are the kind of things you have to keep in mind as you're designing a product, as you're building a product. Same thing over here on the right. If you've used Netflix before, you're probably familiar with the genres that Netflix uses. So they'll have action movies or, all kinds of really specific genres that Netflix believes you'll be interested in. So one example of a genre is LGBTQ plus content, right? So there's movies and there's TV shows, and this is useful if you're interested in that content. But Netflix product runs in almost 200 countries around the world, and different countries have different laws and regulations about frankly about sexuality. So I think Uganda is maybe the most stark example where there are laws that essentially outlaw homosexuality. So you can kind of imagine if you were in Uganda, if you're in a public space, if this kind of genre was to pop up on your screen and somebody oversaw that, there could be a safety issue there, right? You could be putting your users in harm's way based on the choices that you've made from a product perspective. So this is just kind of a few examples of product safety. I think it's a really, really interesting and really big topic, as you can imagine. But I did want to at least kind of acknowledge that this is a sort of complementary piece, that if you're working on the product side of things, you're probably going to have to think about these things. So if we dig into product security, this is kind of my imperfect model. This is not perfect, but this is, based on my experience, there's a lot of different things that come together when you're thinking about protecting a product. And this is sort of how I roughly organize things. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it doesn't necessarily map to an organizational chart or anything like that. But these are the sort of the bits and pieces that comprise product security from my perspective. And so we won't spend too much time here, but we'll dig into each one of these and just see kind of how they contribute. And I always like to start with infrastructure security. And infrastructure security to me is you're trying to provide a foundation, a secure, solid foundation upon which you can build and operate your product. So if you think about, probably the simplest analogy is, building a house, right? You can have the nicest house and the fanciest architecture, but if you're building it on top of, sand or, mud or whatever, and not a solid foundation, you're going to have problems, right? It's very, very difficult to build a secure product on a weak foundation or on poor infrastructure. So if you're kind of starting from the ground up, you want to make sure you have solid infrastructure to build upon. So when I think about infrastructure security, and especially as it applied to Netflix, you think about things like servers and networks and systems that sort of run the software that your product runs upon. And at Netflix, we were really heavy users of Amazon Web Services. So it was, the product was mostly in the public cloud. So we were relying on Amazon to sort of do a good job providing reliable infrastructure, secure infrastructure upon which we could build the Netflix streaming product. And then we also see here this kind of like red box here. This is also, this is the piece of hardware that we designed. It's called OpenConnect. And OpenConnect is the content delivery network that Netflix uses. And the content delivery network is used so that the audio and video files are really geographically close to the end user so that it's a high performance system. So, we designed this hardware, we built the hardware, we ran the software. So you think about there's thousands and thousands of these boxes in sort of networks and service providers all around the world so that you can have a kind of very performant experience when you're using Netflix, no matter where you are in the world. So this is also part of the infrastructure and part of what goes into creating, product security for Netflix. Next is what I like to call ecosystem security. Sometimes you'll hear, third-party security, or I always like the phrase ecosystem because I want to be inclusive of vendors, of partners, of suppliers, different providers. And really, if you work in any kind of modern, most modern systems, you're probably not going to do everything yourself, right? You're going to rely on a bunch of different providers, right? You're going to sort of work on the software or the features that are most differentiated, and then you're going to rely on a bunch of other providers to kind of sort of chip in. And examples at Netflix were, you may have paid for Netflix through your cell provider, right? So we partnered with companies like T-Mobile to provide, basically, if you were a T-Mobile a cell phone subscriber, you could potentially get Netflix as part of your plan. You could also pay for your plan through T-Mobile. So then T-Mobile is a partner for us, and so then we're relying on them to some degree for our product security. You also, if you've used a smart TV, you may have seen, like, for example, a Samsung TV that has actually a Netflix button on the remote, right? So we have Netflix software running on a Samsung TV, and that's sort of part of the ecosystem that comprises the Netflix experience. So then our security requirements then extend to that environment. And then over here on the right, I just show this as an example. This was an incident that happened while I was there. We had one of our partners, it was called Larson Studios. They did sort of sound and a bunch of other kind of finishing things on content that we showed on the service. And there was a series that Netflix has called Orange is the New Black, and Larson Studios was involved in the sort of post-production work on that series. They were actually compromised, and the person who compromised Larson they basically were able to get some episodes before we released them, and they made them available on piracy sites. So it was interesting in that for when I was at Netflix and this happened with Orange is the New Black, we had actually, engaged a separate studio called Lionsgate to produce Orange is the New Black. So you can kind of think of, you sort of pay them and they kind of take care of it for you, and then you own that intellectual property. And then, Lionsgate had used Larson Studios for that work. So in that case, we would think of that not as a third party, but actually a fourth party. So it's kind of like a partner of a partner. So whenever you have a really complex environment, chances are there's multiple links in that chain in terms of your dependencies in your ecosystem. It can be very, very difficult to identify all those. But as you can see here from this example, any problem that you have in that ecosystem can eventually bubble up and sort of cause you a security issue. So this is kind of what we think about ecosystem security. So I would even put in things like open source. We use a lot of open source security. So you also have to think of that as part of your ecosystem. It's part of that external environment upon which you're relying to deliver your product. Next, we have operations. And, operations are, so when you build a product, when you build an online product, it's not a static thing, right? It's always changing and people are using it, right? So I think about the operations component of product security is, how do you actually keep the thing running securely as people are using it and throughout its life cycle? So here, these are just some examples here. So you have customer service. So maybe you lost, or maybe you had a payment issue, right? And you're trying to use Netflix, and I don't know, you want to change your payment information, or maybe you got, your credit card got canceled. So you call into customer service. So customer service is going to need to verify your identity before they make changes to your account. So to me, I think about that as part of product security, because somebody wants to sort of make a change to an account. You don't want to allow just anybody to do that. So customer service ends up being a really, really large surface for product security operations. You think about trust and safety. So, you have a lot of times people will have, what we would call account takeover, or you'll sometimes hear that shortened as ATO. So you're using an account and somebody gains access to it. Maybe they got access to your username and password. And now, oops, I've lost control of my account. Somebody else is using it. So trust and safety is really around how do we identify, those kinds of things, like when perhaps somebody has taken over somebody else's account. And then you sort of push that all the way through to remediation, because you don't want to just identify it. You want to get the legitimate owner back in control of their account. There's things like, PSIRT, or, product security incident response team. So a lot of times you'll have, vulnerabilities out in the ecosystem or in the running product, and you have to, you may have to manage that issue like an incident, because you want to keep the product running while you're also fixing the problem that's underlying it. And the last one here, I didn't have to really deal with this a lot at Netflix, because we were really a B2C product. So it's a consumer product, right? Business to consumer. So, but for a lot of companies, you're B2B, right? You're business to business sales. So it's your one business selling to another business. And in those cases, for better or worse, there's a lot of, what we would call third-party risk management, where a buyer, before they buy a piece of software, they want to understand the security posture of that software, right? So they want to understand, hey, are you compliant with, ISO 27001 or whatever, PCI compliant? It doesn't really matter. But the sort of GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance function, can sort of manage that program to ensure that those compliance requirements are met, and also sort of be able to kind of express that compliance posture to potential customers. So that tends to be a big part of product security operations as well, especially for large SaaS providers, business to business SaaS providers. Then we have privacy and data protection, and this is really around keeping personal data secure and private, and meeting your privacy obligations to your end users, right? Meeting their expectations. So Netflix, again, when I was there, 200 and something million users across 190 different countries. If you're at all familiar with privacy regulation, it's very, very fragmented globally. Like even in the United States, there's no single laws that, different states have different requirements. So there's a lot of different, mandates and compliance requirements that you have to be able to adhere to. But ultimately, it's about keeping customer data safe. It's about being clear and explicit about how you use customer data. I have here, GDPR, which is sort of the EU's kind of overarching privacy regime. You also have things like subject access requests, and that's basically when any user of a service can ask the service provider, in Netflix's case, hey, Netflix, give me a copy of my data, right? You've probably seen this feature in a lot of online products where you can, sort of download a copy of your data. So that's actually a pretty complex process. So we sort of built out this infrastructure so that you as a Netflix user could download that, and you can kind of see, what data does Netflix have about me? And you can also ask it for it to be deleted. And this is all in service of privacy, not just privacy compliance requirements, but just, you want to meet, you want to be able to meet the customer's legitimate expectations around how you're handling their data, who you're sharing it with, what you're doing with it, those kinds of things. This example here, this screenshot, thankfully, this was actually from before my time at Netflix, but so there was a lawsuit around privacy at Netflix. I think it started in 2009 because the company, and for folks who have been around a while, you may remember that Netflix actually started as a DVD by mail company. And back kind of in those days, they ran this contest called the Netflix Prize. And the idea was to provide a set of all of this kind of data around how people use the service to see if you could come up with a better recommendations algorithm than Netflix had. And the idea was, well, all this data was, sort of quote unquote real data, but it had been anonymized. And as it turns out, anonymizing data is really difficult. And researchers were actually able to do some identification. And that's kind of what this lawsuit was related to. The last piece I'll talk about, and this is perhaps the largest piece. I mean, each of those pieces that I talked about are quite large, infrastructure security, et cetera. So application security, I think of it as the sort of mechanisms that you're using to secure the software that goes into your product. And again, lots of different ways to think about application security. I think one kind of simpler way of thinking about it, I kind of sort of divide it into three areas. The first area, I think about the development lifecycle. And this is kind of, I think about like, how are you working with developers in your organization so that they're building secure software? So you might consult with them. You might do things like, design reviews or threat modeling. There's things like you can train your developers to write secure code. You could have, what we would call security champions programs. You might have heard things like software composition analysis, software bill of materials. So these are, basically the way software gets built and deployed and run. This, sort of plug in security into this part of the process. The next one, and this is, I call it vulnerability management, and this certainly applies to things broader than just application security. But, a very, very large part of security is finding bugs and fixing bugs, right? That's, I had an old colleague kind of call this the hamster wheel of pain, right? If you ever see a hamster running on the wheel. This just never goes away, right? And you sort of, on my entire career, you're always finding problems, you're always fixing problems. And there's lots of ways to find problems. So you can do penetration testing, for example. And this is, I think, it was mentioned earlier on, but this, you do an attack simulation. You try to model what an attacker would do to see if you can find bugs. There's fuzzing, there's dynamic analysis. There's really an unlimited ways of finding bugs in software. And then, sort of last but not least is over here, security engineering, which I kind of think of as, sort of building the security relevant components for your product. So you could be building security features. Again, kind of using a Netflix example, you might be able to use, MFA, multi-factor authentication to log into Netflix, where in addition to using your username and password to log in, they'll also send you a code to your mobile phone. So building that kind of feature is security engineering, because you're building a security relevant feature into the product. You could also be building kind of underlying platform components that developers use. A good example would be like cryptographic infrastructure. So in a large scale consumer service like Netflix, there's many use cases for cryptography, right? Whether you're encrypting data or you're hashing data, you're signing data, you're verifying signatures. So these are not the kind of things that you want developers to figure out on their own. So you may have like a platform security team that does cryptographic services. That's the kind of team that we have. We also built things like anti-fraud systems, anti-abuse systems. So, and then you also potentially build frameworks for example, for UI developers to use that can more securely handle data to avoid things like cross-site scripting and things like that. So that's application security, and that's actually the last piece that I was going to cover. So, just a real short summary. I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're still learning. This is not a perfect model. It's one way to look at it. I always encourage people to be open-minded, but it's helpful to have a model to work from, and so that you can sort of get people on the same page. But it's by no means perfect. It's by no means finished. I mean, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I really love the idea of product security, because hopefully, as you saw, it really involves a lot of different parts of not just a security organization, but the overall team, right? Your product managers, your developers, marketing, things like that. So I think we have plenty of time for questions. So I'm not exactly sure the format of how we'll handle those, but that's all I had kind of slides wise. So we can kind of go from there.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jason. I'm sure a lot of you learned many things about product security. I for sure did. I've always thought about product security, but product safety is a new thing for me. And I'm gonna, as Mandy said, on our separate chat, we're gonna look at Netflix completely differently now. So now, as we move on to our Q&A part of this meeting, we do have a couple of canned questions we'd like to start with. But I'd like to invite the audience members to share all of your questions in the chat. We will take them one by one as the time allows us to. So the first question for you, Jason, would be, what's the difference between application security and product security?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because a lot of times I will hear people kind of equate those. So I think they're certainly related. Like there's, if you think about a Venn diagram, there's an overlap. So I think about, as kind of as that model I showed, I think about application security as a component of product security, but there's so much more that goes into it, right? There's the infrastructure, there's the operations, how do you respond to issues? So I think about it as like a component. My guess is like over the years, like the idea, like they'll probably kind of merge together, because the lines can be a little bit fuzzy. But my sense is, in the fullness of time, we'll think about, application security as a separate field will kind of go away, and it will be, because even now, like if you think about, cloud native systems, right? It's like, it's really hard to even separate, where does the infrastructure end? Where does the software begin, right? So it's all become really, kind of combined. So I just think about it as a way of kind of organizing, like who's going to do what, because when you're actually like implementing and when you're running a team, like when I was sort of running the security organization, you sort of have to structure things some way, right? You have to be able to say, hey, these are your responsibilities. These are your responsibilities. So yeah, I would think I think the best way to think about it is application security is a component of product security.
Awesome. So you talked about security engineering in one of your slide decks. What are the skills or what are the specific technical skills that differentiate between an application security engineer and a product security engineer?
Ooh. Now the skills, I would say if I think about the skill difference between say AppSec and ProdSec, if ProdSec is what we would maybe sort of shorten product security to, there's a really strong overlap. I would say generally those skill sets are pretty it's kind of fungible between those two areas. I would say AppSec you could tend to have people who are very skilled at certain elements. Like you have a lot of people in AppSec who are really good at finding vulnerabilities, but you wouldn't want those folks talking to developers, right? Because that's not, because you can find bugs in software, but not actually know how to build software, like in an enterprise context, right? So I think about product security, you have to have a little bit of a broader skill set because you're probably going to be working with certainly with software engineers, but even some of the less kind of, like product managers, for example, like you're going to be working a lot with product managers. So I would say communication skills are going to be more of a must with product security. You're probably going to have a little bit more well-rounded skill set on the product security side because you may be responding to incidents, etc. But depending on the size of your application security team, you could have some real specialization where you just have somebody who's managing the fuzzing infrastructure just to kind of find bugs in an automated way, but they're not at all dealing with the developer community or the product manager community.
Okay, that is amazing. Now moving on to the next question from the chat. How should one prioritize from a small scale company perspective when the cloud or product security ecosystem gets complex with Kubernetes, multi-cloud, and whatnot?
So how should you prioritize? Ooh. I mean, I would, if you kind of think, if you look back at sort of how I talked about infrastructure security, that's the foundation upon what you're going to build. I think you have to start there because if your infrastructure is in bad shape, I just don't see how you can build a secure product on insecure infrastructure. So, if I was forced to choose, right? I think honestly, I think the question was from a small company, but when I started at Netflix, I mean, my job was to basically, kind of create the product security function, the cloud security function. I was an individual contributor. It was just me. There was no team. So that's kind of how I started because it was fairly early days in terms of public cloud. So I kind of went from there and moved my way up. I think but I think, the question is really around prioritization. I would say, I think the sort of the question asker has the right sort of mindset because you have to have a way of prioritizing, right? I'm going to say to some degree, it doesn't matter how you prioritize, but you have to make clear to your stakeholders and to your company how you're prioritizing, right? So you need to be able to explain to people, this is why I'm working on this first, and then this, and then this, right? And you might do that in a quantitative way, a qualitative way. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter at all, right? But there's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. But I think what you want to do is have a really clear sense of how you're making those decisions and in a way that you can explain and make transparent to folks who are going to be interested.
Awesome. Some great questions in the chat as well. So I have this came up in the chat, and I'll be honest with you, as a consultant, I've seen this hotly debated. So weigh in here. Is cloud just part of the infrastructure, or do you see it as its own separate environment?
Well, I think we're not doing ourselves a lot of favors because, the original definition of cloud, you sort of split it to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. So like Gmail is cloud, right? EC2, which is, the compute platform in AWS, is the cloud, right? Salesforce is the cloud. So it's, I think, but the problem is then you look at particular, like in the vendor space, you have things like cloud security posture management, right? CSPM. That actually tends to only focus on infrastructure, right? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think of like cloud is a way of doing things, right? Like you're gonna do things differently if you're using, say, infrastructure as a service or software as a service versus if you're hosting it all yourself. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways. I would say, I didn't really talk about it in the presentation, but whenever I think about org charts or like responsibilities and like who does what, I mean, I love to talk about security. I actually also really love to talk about org design because there's a million ways you can do it. The one thing I would say is the adversary doesn't care about your org chart, right? So when somebody is trying to like compromise Netflix, they don't care how I may have organized the team. They're just going to do their thing. So if you organize things in a way where those teams have a hard time collaborating or they don't have visibility or they're duplicating work, you're kind of causing yourself problems. And I think, look, we're humans, right? We have like many, many flaws and it can be difficult to work together. But that's going to be that's a problem that you as the leader have to solve, right? You have to get people to work together for a common purpose. So yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think like you could debate those kinds of questions all day. I think at the end of the day, though, ultimately, you're going to have to put together an organization and a capability that's going to be able to meet your organization's objectives. And I think kind of going back to that prioritization piece, it doesn't really matter as long as you can articulate how you're doing it and that you can sort of defend the way you're doing it. I would say one of the ways that I would do that, like handle those kinds of thorny issues where like you could reasonably have either perspective, but you have to decide, right? You can't do both. So you choose one. And, we would do these things. We would call them like a decision log. And we say, look, this is how we're going to handle this problem. And like, we're not going to talk about it again for another year. We'll revisit in another year. Until we revisit it, this is how we're doing it. So the reason why I always like to write it down is because if somebody starts next week, right, they're going to know, well, why do we do it this way? Point them to that document. This is why. Like you can reasonably have a different opinion. Not that we don't care about that opinion, but the debate is over. Let's do the work. When it comes time, we'll talk about it again.
I love that. And I really love what you said about, what does the attacker care about? Because one of the comments that I see quite a lot is, all your shiny degrees and all your certifications, hackers don't care. They come and get us. But we also know in security, a lot of times when you're trying to get your foot in the door, either as a career changer or as somebody new, those certifications can really help you get in that door. So for our audience here, for some career changers, some folks that are maybe trying to transition, whether it's from AppSec or GRC, are there any certifications, sort of skill sets that you see as ideal? Are there any sort of community, meaning low cost, we put the elbow grease in and maybe not the money, where people could get started if they wanted to go into product security?
Yeah, I love this topic. And, I would say just to kind of as on background, I mean, that's kind of what I did I would say I would sort of caveat this with saying I got into this field in the 90s and so my experience is probably not, it's not perfectly relevant. But, when I went to college, I got a sociology degree, right? There was no, there was certainly computer science, but there wasn't cybersecurity. Now I ended up going to my master's, many years later. But when I wanted to get into cybersecurity and really into technology broadly, that's exactly what I did. I pursued certifications. I would say, partially, for that idea of, hey, how do I demonstrate to potential employers that I have the skills necessary? But also, frankly, it just provides you a really nice structured learning path, right? Because if I all of a sudden just decide, hey, I want to learn about cybersecurity, I mean, it's a huge field. It's very broad. It's very deep. Where do you start? I think certification paths. I mean, sometimes one of the things I really dislike is a lot of people in the industry, they kind of will sort of badmouth certifications. I'm like, not everybody can go to college. I mean, it's, I think to me, when I would see somebody's resume that had certifications, the one thing I know, whether they are sort of appropriate for the role or not, I know this person took the initiative to learn skills in the field they're interested in. So that to me is what I would call a green flag. So I think that that's a good thing. Now, in terms of the sort of which ones would I pursue? There's a ton. I mean, I would say in terms of like the lower cost, and this is less of a certification, but I think OWASP is always been the Open Web Application Security Project. There's just so many great learning resources out there. A lot of the capture the flags, the CTFs that are out there. There's these sort of cyber ranges now where you can kind of practice your skills. I know a lot of people are pretty, they're keen on things like I think it's called like the OSCP, the offensive security certifications. There's quite a lot out there. And there's also, on the free side, I know some of the big vendors I think Google has made a lot of their certifications free and their learning paths free. I've actually poked at a few of them, but they're quite good. I would say it's easy to get overwhelmed, but I think it's good to maybe like try a few out. But I think that's totally, at least, it was helpful for me. I don't know that it helped me get a job, but it helped me get confidence that, I could build the skills that are important to potential employers. So I think certification is a totally reasonable approach.
Yeah, and I know I'm a kind of a recovering network engineer now, moving more into cybersecurity, and in that case, they'll say get the A plus, the Net plus, Security plus, specifically for somebody who wants to learn more about product security. What are kind of those resources that you go to learn more about what that role looks like?
Well, I think that's part of the problem is that there isn't any. Right. Well, there's fewer because you'll see learning paths for application security, which, to the earlier question, like they're not the same thing. They're like, hopefully by the presentation, you kind of saw, they're related, but they're different. I think the thing with product security, I mentioned like people don't really agree on definitions. There's a lot of people who look at product security as just, let me find the bugs. Let's find the bugs. And they're not thinking about like the safety side. They're not thinking about the user experience side. They're not thinking about the security engineering side. I think, if I were going to recommend like a couple of resources, there's a book called, and the author just passed away recently, but called Security Engineering by Ross Sanderson. I actually have a copy. There it is right there on the bookshelf. It's such a great book. It's very accessible. He was a professor for many years, and it talks through like these real world use cases of like, here's how bank security works. Here's how airplane security works. So, it's sort of like he was a computer scientist and a computer security person. But when you see these kind of examples from other fields, because, there's been a lot of talk recently, you may have seen like the CSRB report on, Microsoft security issues. Like if you look at like aviation security, right? They have a very, very formal and very tested kind of approach for how they investigate issues. It's super mature. We don't have that in security, but we do have some. So I think that book would be a great start to kind of look at, how do you think about, hey, if I'm going to design like a global streaming subscription service, right? What do I need to think about? Well, one good way to think about that is you look at adjacent fields, right? You look at other related fields like, well, how did, the medical profession think about security of, say, prescription medication? How did the aviation field think about it? How do banks think about it? Because, one of the quotes I use sometimes for the stats is that if you think about like bank security, like actually going to your bank, right? You would think like, who's going to rob a bank, right? There's one way in. They got cameras, they got guards, they have a limited amount of money. There's still in the United States something like 4,000 bank robberies every year. So it still happens. But, the bank industry has been able to get like the loss level to something that is, it's acceptable to them, right? And I only use that example because if you think about a bank, like, geez, I got to put myself at very serious risk to rob a bank, but people still do it. Whereas in the online world, I could be anywhere. I'm at very low risk and there's 1,000 ways to get in. So it kind of shows you, like the scope of the problem and kind of, you know, how robust and kind of I would say varied your thinking has to be to really kind of think about product security in a really kind of fulsome, you know, thorough way. Because it's not just about finding bugs. So I would say AppSec is a totally reasonable route into it, but it's so much more than that. So yeah, I would say, you know, I myself am a reader, so I love to read. I think there's a lot of good. I think a good way to learn is there's some really good conferences that focus on product security. So actually, I'll be presenting in a couple of months. Loco Moco Sec. They and a lot of them have their videos online. So B-Sides SF has great product security talks. So honestly, that's probably the best way now to think about product security is like look, and these are most of these are available on YouTube. So go there, look at those playlists. And because what you're mostly going to hear is like I talked about today, you're going to hear about how real world practitioners are doing it. And you're going to see a lot of variance because, you know, as I mentioned, frankly, we're still kind of figuring things out. You know, I usually think about it as like, I don't know where we are. I don't know if we're in the Stone Ages, you know, the Bronze Age. I don't know. We're certainly not, you know, in kind of the Jetsons in the future, right? We're still figuring things out. And I think when you look at the news and you see how many security incidents happen and breaches and ransomware, you kind of get a sense of, yeah, we probably have quite a lot to figure out. So I would say that also as, although it's a big, broad field, it's very deep, it's a perfect time to get in because there are so many difficult problems to solve. You know, it's just I mean, that's why, you know, even though I retired a few years ago, I still love the field. There's so much left to be done, and I love to talk to folks who are interested in it.
Great. While we're talking about the future and what the future has in place for us, we have a lot of questions about roles and the changing landscape of product security. So about the type of product security roles, do you foresee any changes in the future, that is specialized security product managers or security BI analysts, etc.? Another question we have on this on the same lines is, do you see AI, Gen AI LLMs affect product security scope and roles?
Ooh, yeah, those are good questions. I think on the role side, yeah, I think you mentioned at the tail end. I think that those are two areas that are going to grow quite a lot. Like this idea of a security focused product manager. That was one of the things actually when I was at Netflix, I really kind of pushed for a long time. Is like you want to have somebody who is not just worried about revenue and conversion. Like you want somebody who's thinking about security and safety from the end user's perspective. So I think product management, I think things like analytics, I think that those are going to keep growing. Certainly, you know, AppSec, you know, security engineering, those are all going to be big. I think with Gen AI, you know, there's sort of like, I've talked about, you know, AI, you know, this quite a lot recently, as you can imagine. I kind of think there's sort of two things, right? One is like, how do you use AI to make security better, right? And I think there's just some amazing things you can do with Gen AI to like feed it a block of source code and summarize it, or you know, write me a function to do something. And so, really, I think you're going to see some really amazing efficiency advances. And then you also have to think about, well, what about how do we secure Gen AI? I think that's very much like an unknown, frankly. There's a lot of startups in the space. One thing I would say, I always like to, you know, if I kind of zoom out and think about where is the field going, I always like to think about what are these kind of trends, you know, what we would call secular trends, right? These are the trends, they're only going one way, right? They're not cyclical. So the one, you know, there's a few that I always bet on, right? Is I think about, well, regulation, we never become less regulated, right? You only ever become more regulated. And I think about you only ever have more software, right? You never say, oh, well, we're going to shrink things. And when I think about Gen AI, it makes software much easier to write. So even if you're not a software engineer, so when you make software easier to write, you're going to have more software. And when you have more software, you have more need for things like application security and product security. So, and I think I've always thought like, you know, I spent many years hiring security people, and product security and application security was one of the hardest skill sets to find. So if you think about that's already like a resource constrained subfield with all the code that AI is going to create, we're really going to need to think about the problem in a different way to kind of get our handle on the scale. So my sense is we'll probably be able to use Gen AI to make ourselves. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg sort of problem. It's like it's going to cause us problems. It's going to solve problems. So I like to be optimistic. So I like to think it's going to solve more problems than create. But who knows? I also watched, the Terminator movies, and so I know what Skynet can do. So we'll see.
Awesome. So talking about another question about roles in security, and about your experience at Netflix as well. So how did you structure the product security team at Netflix? Were ProdSec engineers embedded in the product team to become SMEs in that product?
We had a little bit of a kind of hybrid operation when I was there, and it's sort of changed a little bit. So I'll only kind of talk about how I set it up. So I set up one org to be like an umbrella over product and application security, and so that was centralized. But there was also kind of a distributed team, what you would consider an embedded team, that was working on device security. Because I mentioned, right, there's sort of billions of different devices running Netflix software, and the idea was that team, a lot of the folks they worked with were the device software teams, so it was a little bit more efficient to have that team embedded. But I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. I would say very similar to when I was sort of introducing things. If you ask 5 different people, to define these things, you ask 5 different security leaders how they set it up, they're going to do it 5 different ways. And I think there's a lot of ways to be successful. You're always making trade-offs with org design. That's one thing I learned through sort of years of experience in leadership. There is no perfect org chart. So I would say you have to kind of, there's a lot of like competing priorities and things you have to balance off. But I would always, kind of go back to that quote, right? Your adversary doesn't care about it, right? They're going to do their thing. You have to figure out the way to do your thing. And that's, frankly, that's probably the hardest part about, leading a security team is like, how do you get humans to work together well?
Yeah, for sure. I think we have a couple more questions in the chat. So, right. Okay, so there's a specific question from the GRC domain. Could you please guide what additional skills are required for transitioning into product security from GRC domain?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to. I mean, I think GRC is a huge domain. There are a lot of different sort of skills there. I think if I was going to try to transition into product security, because I think if you think about people who typically work on product security teams, they probably have like a software engineer. Many of them are going to have software engineering backgrounds, either formally through school or self-taught. It doesn't really matter. But I think it's important to know, like, how do products actually get built, right? How do you gather requirements? How do you actually prioritize those? How do you build a roadmap? How do you build software and run software? So I think, if I would want to make sure, if I'm coming from the GRC space, that I understood how that works. Like, how does software actually get delivered, right? How does a product actually get delivered, right? Because you see something like, to use a Tesla example. Well, that's cool. You see it on the road, but what went into doing that, like designing it and building it and speccing it and figuring out all the security features? So I think you probably have to start there, is you're making sure you gain some understanding of how software and products are actually built. And then, figuring out how to inject some of those skills, some of those, like, I kind of mentioned about those subdomains, whether it's infrastructure or response or, application security on top of that.
Great.
That's awesome, Jason.
So,
yeah, just a quick time check. We only have 3 minutes left here. So, Jason, I'm going to turn this over to you. Any great stories, any other feedback that you want to share in these last 3 minutes with the audience?
Oh yeah, no, I thank you for having me. It was great. So many good questions. I would say, also, of course, we couldn't answer everything. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to, connect and answer there. Yeah, I think my biggest thing I would want to impart is, certainly there's so much need for for security. Like, don't feel like there's not a place for you just because, yeah, I don't have this background, I don't have that background. Like I said, I have a sociology degree. I did a lot of kind of self learning, and it's so big, it's deep. Don't get overwhelmed. Like, find some things that are interesting to you and just kind of pull that thread. That, like, I know people have a lot of different learning styles. That's kind of what I do. I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, let me kind of dig into that a little bit, and then you do that a few times, and before you know it, like, you're starting to build a really, solid base of understanding. Um, and I think, these kinds of things are great too, because, when it's good to be around like a cohort and a group of folks that are like-minded and who you can share your own learning path with and your own kind of experience. Yeah. And I say, I think it's just the security community, it's over the years, it's gotten better about being more kind of welcoming and inclusive. I would say we still have a long way to go, but I think most people are willing to kind of share and talk. I certainly, people will reach out to me all the time, and I can't chat with everybody, but I am always happy to, I try to, as I can, talk with folks. I would say one tip I would give is, to be real specific. If you're networking or something and you reach out, rather than saying, hey, I want to pick your brain about something, be like, hey, I'd love to know how you thought about, this particular security problem at this company. And, some people are not going to answer, some people are going to turn you down, but, keep trying. Just kind of put yourself out there, especially as you're kind of doing like career transition. I know it can be a little bit, a little bit discouraging sometimes when you're, job searching. It can be tough, but yeah, I think it's such an interesting field, and I think there's so many cool things to learn. And like I said, we're nowhere close to solving all the problems. Like, I mean, I could, if I put on, my binoculars, I can't even see the time there is no time we're never going to be done. So it's always a good time to get into security. I think it's always a great time. There's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of, a lot of different things that you can kind of poke into. So I say, go for it.
That sounds amazing, Jason. Thanks a lot to you for sharing all of your knowledge and a lot of things that we learned today. And a special vote of thanks to everyone who joined us today, and appreciate all of your wonderful questions. I hope you all learned something from this session, and will be continuing to attend the future sessions as well. I'm happy to share that our next speaker would be Shivani Arni, who is the Deputy CISO at Tech Mahindra, and she would be sharing her expertise in field and her path to success. We have linked a bunch of things in the chat, so please go into the chat and click on the links, and you'll find a lot of information there. So thanks a lot for everyone joining us today. Thanks for your time.